Friends, very warm welcome. Lovely to see you. James, very good to see you too.
And exceptionally good to see you too, Ian. Yes.
James, this is number 119 in our videos.
It is. And I feel sure that you know something important about the number 119. It might even be one of your favourite numbers.
It's quite close to one of my favourite numbers. The reason is it only has two factors, because 119 is 7 times 17.
Right. Okay. That's rather nutty.
And the reason why that's interesting, well, obviously 7 is a significant number, but our viewers might not be aware of why 17 is such a significant number. And I don't know whether you do off the top of your head either.
Are you meaning significant biblically?
Yes, I am.
No, I'm thinking Ezekiel. I'm thinking Ezekiel. I'm thinking Day of Pentecost.
You are. Yes, you. Oh, well, very good, very good. Yes, you are.
I got there.
And the reason
that was good, wasn't it?
You did. Okay, well, for our viewers, just to enlighten them. So, in Ezekiel 47, the vision of the stream flowing from the new temple, this vision of the renewed temple, restored temple, the stream flows down, and it flows for people to fish from the Dead Sea, and in particular, it flows through En Gedi and En Eglaim. And the gematria, the Hebrew value of the letters of Gedi is 17, and of Eglaim is 153. And 153 is the triangle of 17. So if you arrange a triangle of things of side 17, you get 153 of them. And you mentioned Acts and Pentecost, didn't you?
I did, yes. And of course, there are 17 different nationalities mentioned by Luke in there on the day of Pentecost, aren't there?
That's right. And they say, what is this we hear and speak in our own language? Yeah. Jews from this. Exactly. And then, of course, in John 21, they have the big catfish, and there's 153 of them. So
this is about the mission.
We might even have talked about that in one of our videos.
I believe we have done. I'm sure we have done, actually. Yeah.
There we go. So there you go. This is episode 119, friends. This is 7, the number of completeness, times 17, the number of the mission of the people of God, as the stream that flows from Jesus' side brings life to people in all parts of the world. And of course, we're part of that. So that's very exciting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, we mustn't just talk about numbers. We need to talk about our reading for this week. So tell us where we are.
Well, the lectionary is on Trinity 21, and we're given Mark 10, 35 to 45. But I feel that that's probably not an ideal reading for reasons that maybe you will explain, Ian.
Yes, I can. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? For the last couple of weeks, we've been really excited that the lectionary has not messed around with the readings, and it's a continuous reading through Mark. So one passage following another. And we were saying, great, well done, lectionary people. And lo and behold, we get to this one and they don't do it. So that's really frustrating, isn't it? Because our reading last week ended at verse Mark 10:31.
Yes.
And then they simply skipped out 3 verses and gone on to Mark 10:35 to 45. And actually, it's a bit annoying they've done that, because the reading that they set this week is quite short. It's much shorter than the ones we've had in the last few weeks. So it just seems to me to be completely unnecessary.
Yeah, definitely. And the comments that in those early verses, 31 to 34, seem so very much related to the passage that we've got. I mean, not least the fact that there's 2 Son of Man sayings at the beginning, at the end, but also the subject matter, because it seems that what we have here is Jesus' third prediction of his passion, and then we have James and John battling for position, in the eschaton. And the contrast Mark sets up here is so very, very, the subject of it is so very, very obvious, that the Jesus' self-giving love and the disciples' self-interest, you really need the first verses to set the contrast up.
Yes, you really do. Well, in that case, friends, what we're going to do is we are going to comment from verse 32 through to 45.
Yeah.
And when I consulted my bishop in the diocese, I was a curate, and he was the chair of the liturgical commission, and I pointed out some of these problems, and he said, well, the lectionary is advisory. So he gives us permission to actually tweak the lectionary when we think actually we could do better with this selection of verses. So friends, do that, tweak away if you're following the lectionary. So we'll start with verse 32. And as we commented last week, the reason why last week's pericope was so satisfying is precisely because it was demarcated by 2 references to journeying, isn't it? And here we get the reference to journeying, which matches the one at the beginning of last week's reading. So we had, sorry, I'm just scrolling back. Yes, it was
verse
10:17 last week.
17, yeah, as they were on the
As Jesus
journey.
setting out on his journey, that's
Yeah,
right. And then now we've got what clearly is the beginning of another section of the narrative on the road.
yeah.
And in fact, it says on the road. They were on the road, which is quite interesting. On the way.
Yes, on the way.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because in Acts, that's how Luke describes the followers of Jesus, people who are on the way. So
Members of
here
the
they
way.
are.
Yeah,
But of course, they're going up to Jerusalem. You always go up to the holy city. I mean,
yes.
it's partly a geographical reference, isn't it? Because it's on a hill and you have to climb up to it. But of course, it illustrates its significance as well. So
Yes, and we still use that phrase, don't we? We still go up to cities. We go up to London, even if you all live north of it. And
yes, or if you live higher up than it because it's
yes,
in a
exactly.
river valley.
Yeah, you still go up to London. Yeah.
I've always found this next phrase of Mark's really intriguing and revealing, and I think it's very Markan. I mean, it's that I'm pretty certain. I haven't looked at the parallels. It's distinctive of Mark here. I don't think the other Gospels have quite the same thing.
It's a favourite word of Mark, isn't it?
Yeah, Jesus was walking ahead of them.
Yeah.
And they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. It's interesting that in the NIV it says the disciples were astonished, and those who followed were afraid. But actually, the Greek doesn't say it's disciples. They sort of fill that in.
Yeah.
So, and of course, those who followed, akalutheo, is a discipleship kind of word, isn't it? So,
yes, I mean, you can be both amazed and frightened at the same time. I mean, in fact, it's really very common, I would have said, isn't it? I mean, that's a perfectly reasonable mixture of emotion.
But of course, the question is, what are they afraid of? Are they afraid of Jesus's determination? Are they afraid of where he's going? And I guess, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? You'd kind of think that if they're afraid, then he would say something to comfort them, but he doesn't.
No, he doesn't. He immediately takes them aside and begins to tell them, well, of why their fear might be well founded in a way, because he tells them about what's going to happen to him, and clearly there's going to be a knock-on effect to his followers as a result of what's going to happen to him. So it's interesting. He doesn't pull his punches, does he, Jesus? In that sense.
No, he doesn't. And one thing that's really striking, I mean, you mentioned this is the third prediction of the Passion. So we had the first one in chapter 8. We had the second one in
9.
I've forgotten. 9. And now here in chapter 10. What's quite interesting here is there seems to be a lot more detail here. They will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him.
Yeah.
Now, again, I think a historical skeptic would say, here we are, here's the memory of what happened being projected back. But I'm not entirely sure. I mean, that is what he would have seen happen to people who were crucified.
That was pretty standard stuff, I would have said, yeah.
Yeah. A couple of things quite interesting here is that, again, he details the fact that he's going to be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes. I was getting quite struck by the fact that the detail here, they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. So it's quite interesting, isn't it, that in this prediction, he's very clear. It's not the Jewish authorities who kill him. The Jewish authorities hand him over.
Yes.
And it's the Romans who kill him.
Yes. Absolutely.
I mentioned last week David Garland's commentary, which I've been using. I looked again this week. David Garland makes a lovely comment. He says that the Jews hand him over to the Gentiles hand him over to death, or they hand him over to God, but God raises him from the dead. Yeah. So it's just an interesting chain of actions there. After 3 days he will rise, or on the third day he will rise.
Yeah.
So, but of course, then that sets the context for what follows. Verse 35: James and John, the sons of Zebedee. Is it significant they're the sons of Zebedee? They're the sons of thunder. We know them, don't we?
Yes, which Mark has told us is their nickname in chapter 3. And so I suppose he's expecting us to remember that, and remember that they are, well, what does sons of thunder mean? I mean, it means that they are thunderous. It means that they are passionate,
unpredictable,
outspoken, perhaps a bit aggressive about pushing for themselves. I don't know. But it does create an idea. I mean, I had a training incumbent who was called John. So people used to quit this about us, though I think neither of us fitted that description. But it is interesting. I mean, this is the only place in Mark where James and John are mentioned together apart from the 12.
Yeah.
and or indeed from Peter, because obviously Peter, James, and John are part of that inner circle of disciples. And I think you do get an impression of their character. I mean, John, we mentioned this a couple of weeks ago in the passage in
Yes.
chapter 9 about the demons. I mean,
Yes.
John,
Yes.
he's quite happy to take people to task on his own authority if he
Yeah.
thinks that some slur is being visited upon their faith in Jesus or whatever. He
Yeah.
stops them casting out demons. So there seems
Mm.
to be quite in character of the two of them. Well, certainly of
Mm.
John, and I suspect the brothers.
Mm.
Maybe they're similar.
And it's interesting in the Gospels, we get only just sort of glimpses, really, of the different
Yeah,
characters, but it is interesting that the glimpses are pretty consistent.
yeah, yeah,
Um, and of course, they address him as teacher. We've seen that again. We had the rich young ruler last week addressed to Jesus as teacher, good
yeah,
teacher, then teacher. So yet again, that's really consistent in this Gospel. But a quite astonishing request. We want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. I mean, that is extraordinary. And as you say, it is more extraordinary because it follows in the text immediately after
yeah.
Jesus talking about his own suffering. Again, David Garland has a lovely phrase here. He says, as Jesus draws nearer to his ordeal, the disciples do not draw any nearer to understanding.
No, in fact, what they want to do is draw a blank check from Jesus. It would seem. But it's interesting, isn't it, how it's phrased? I mean, when we do that to other people, when we say, I want you, before you actually tell them what it is, it usually indicates that it's some level that it's inappropriate or it's not quite the right thing to ask for, because you need to extract the promise of it before you tell them what it is. So it kind of, they give themselves away, don't they?
Yeah.
And that's fascinating. And of course, when they do finally get to ask, that Jesus doesn't respond. That's interesting, isn't it? He doesn't say, "Oh, carry on." Let's hear what you've got to say. And he
No, but
says,
it's also striking that he doesn't immediately rebuke them either.
"No, he doesn't. No, but he asks the question, "What is it you want me to do for you?"
Yeah.
And that's a really interesting question, because it's a question that comes again in just a few verses and is responded to completely differently in the story of Bartimaeus, isn't it?
Yes, of course.
That's what
And
Jesus.
it's not an uncommon, but it's also not an uncommon response of Jesus.
No,
When
it's not.
people
No,
come
it's
to
not.
him,
It's not.
and he
But
says, "What do you want me to do for you?"
yeah, I think what's interesting is within chapter 10, you get the two very, very different
Yeah.
responses to the question of Jesus. You've
Yes.
got, yeah.
Yes.
But anyway, it's a, yeah. It doesn't
Um,
get an obvious rebuke from Jesus at this stage.
no, it doesn't. Which is extraordinary, isn't it?
Mm.
And then they say, by the way, just notice that I think it's in parallel in Matthew, isn't it, where Matthew
Yeah.
seems to be protecting James on. It's their mothers who come and ask Jesus, not
Yes.
themselves. So,
Yes. That's interesting. Yes.
whether they were commissioned or whether they came directly. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, at one level, it doesn't make much difference in
No.
terms of the
Yeah.
point of the story. Grant to us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. I mean, again, what's extraordinary is, yes, Jesus has mentioned the fact that, excuse me, he will come in his glory. But of course, as we've seen consistently in Mark very tightly juxtaposes any mention of glory with Jesus' immediate mention of humility, of humiliation,
Yeah. Yeah.
and his death and his self-giving.
Yeah.
And again, you get that contrast here, isn't it? Jesus has just been talking about the fact the Son of Man's going to be flogged and they'll spit on him and he's handed over to death. But after 3 days, he will rise. And yet the disciples seem to have jumped completely over the suffering and gone straight to the glory.
Yes, they do. But the fact that they acknowledge the glory that Jesus is going to receive is really interesting, because it kind of indicates that their request is perhaps so often with some of our prayers is a strange mixture of both worship and discipleship, but also self-interest. So that's that feels quite real.
Yeah.
And that's why that question which Jesus asks them, "What do you want me to do for you?" It's such a revealing question for us as disciples, isn't it? I mean, Jesus, if you imagine Jesus asking us that, what, how would you respond? Can tell you quite a lot about yourself.
Yeah. And the phrase they have there, they said to him, grant us to sit one at your right hand and one
Yeah.
at your left in your glory. I mean, the wonderful irony is that when we get to Mark's account of the crucifixion,
Yes.
this phrase occurs again, and it's the thieves who are
Yep.
seated on Jesus' right and his left. I mean, seated in the sense that when people were crucified, there was a little seat that you sat on, and
Yeah.
you know, the arms are outstretched and you pushed up on your feet. So here's the irony, that they are asking for seats in glory when actually what Jesus is really offering left and right is a seat following his example in suffering,
Yeah.
service for the sake of others.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
And then he goes on, you do not know what you're asking for. Well, they clearly don't.
No.
Are you able to drink the cup that I drink and be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? So that's quite repetitive. I think it's repetitive in Greek as well, isn't it? Yes, it is.
Yeah.
With the baptism of which I am baptized, can you be baptized? Which is interesting language, isn't it? I mean, I think Jesus is drawing some Old Testament imagery there in terms of the language of suffering.
Yes, I think he is, because a cup is generally in the Old Testament something that is from God, and most often in the Old Testament it's the cup of God's wrath and judgment. Sometimes it's the cup of joy and prosperity, but most often it's the cup of judgment. And of course, that's how Jesus is using it here, the cup of suffering and death. And I think he draws heavily on the Psalms, and particularly heavily on Isaiah 51, that sort of passages, doesn't he? In this context. So it's quite a common metaphor in biblical terms. Perhaps it's a bit less familiar for us, but it's very common in Scripture.
And the language of baptism, and I mean, immediately, in our minds now reading it, we'd think to the rite of baptism. But of course, we just need to remember that in Greek, baptism means to be plunged into, to immerse, submersed.
Yes.
And of course, that's again imagery from the Psalms. So we're thinking about Psalm 42, for example, where the psalmist had been overwhelmed by all your breakers have broken over me. Where he's overwhelmed by again water often a symbol of suffering, water a symbol of death.
Yeah.
So again, in a culture where generally people didn't swim, so water was a source of fear and of drowning and death. So, and this sense of, I mean, we use it nowadays. We talk about being overwhelmed by things. So,
yes, we do. Yeah.
And immersed in things, immersed in grief or in suffering. So again, I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? That the exchange here is not predictable.
No,
in that
not at all.
Jesus is saying, can you go through the experience of suffering that I'm going to? And they reply with confidence, we are able. I mean, that's a striking response as well, isn't it?
It's a very striking response, given that Jesus has just explained what the cup involves. Very extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, it's almost as if they just haven't grasped the full measure of it all. And I mean, I think also there's a sense. Is there a sense here in which they can't, because the cup that Jesus drinks and the baptism of Jesus is uniquely his, but it's also something which, of course, as followers, we are called to and can be baptized. So our cup is, in a sense, not identical to Jesus, because then he is the only, as we'll come to in a bit, he's the only one who can become a ransom for many. But there is a significant link.
Again, David Garland expresses it really nicely. He says the point is clear to the reader, if not to the disciples. To share Jesus, his kingdom, one has to share his passion, his suffering. No one who enthrones the old values of power without ethics and sacrifice can reign with Jesus. Sorry, I didn't read that right. No one who enthrones the old values of power without ethics and sacrifice can reign with Jesus. In other words, we can't simply enter the kingdom unless we enter that suffering which Jesus has an inherent part of the kingdom.
Well, then, of course, it comes with an interesting caveat, doesn't it? Sit at my right hand, my left is not mine to grant, but it's for those for whom it's been. Yeah, isn't that interesting? I mean, obviously, the implication is that's only for the Father to allocate and to determine. And it kind of gives you this sense of God's purposes can't be thwarted, but they also can't always be deciphered. So you don't know. There's an unknowing, isn't there, here?
And there's part of a little complex where Jesus simply doesn't know everything that the Father, because the Father hasn't
Exactly.
revealed to him. So we get that, for instance, that, in the eschatological narratives at the end of Mark 13 and also in Matthew 24, Jesus says, uh, no one knows the hour, not even the Son, only the Father. And again,
Yeah.
you can see the copies really struggle with that Jesus is, in his humanity, is clearly subordinated to the Father and the will of the Father.
So the implication from Jesus is that you don't follow as a disciple because of the reward, but out of loyalty to him. In other words, you don't follow. As we used to say, it's not pie in the sky when you die, and nor is it cake on the plate while you wait. It's simply loyalty to the person of Jesus Christ. That is,
and it takes us back to that language at the beginning of the disciples and those who followed him. This is about following the path of Jesus. Life, in verse 41, when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. I like the fact David Garden suggests that they weren't indignant because they'd misunderstood. They were indignant because James and John had beaten them to it, and they'd requested the time spots before the disciples had thought of it. So Jesus actually calls the whole of the 12 to them, and he needs to teach the point again to all of them.
Yes. I mean, clearly they harbour similar ambitions, and they realise that they've been excluded by James and John getting there first. Yeah. And this interesting, this phrase that the word which Jesus calls them to him, it's proskalesamenos in Greek, isn't it? This is a word which Mark uses regularly. I think he uses it about 9 times. He uses it regularly to indicate there's a serious discussion or talking to from Jesus. This is a decisive lesson that he needs to communicate. So it's kind of got that overtone of being, well, I don't know if you kind of like this, but if you go being sent to the headmaster's study, almost, it's sort of you're going to be all right. Okay, over here now. It's time for a serious chat.
A talking to chat. Yeah. But having said that, it still continues to me to be an extraordinary mark of grace in Jesus and his patience with the disciples. So he hasn't rebuked James and John. He's taken their request seriously, just as actually he treated the rich young ruler the young man, with seriousness. He took his request seriously at face value. He didn't immediately turn him away or rebuke him or correct him.
No.
And here again, he's doing the same thing, that he's actually calling the disciples to him. And the fact that they continue to fail to understand, even as Jesus' teaching about his destiny becomes clearer. He doesn't push them away and say, well, I'm heading down this route. You haven't understood, so away with you, off with you. His response is to actually draw them in closer and say, look, you need to understand this. And let me say it again, which must have, at a human level, must be very painful. But he makes his teaching clearer and clearer to them, which I think is extraordinary.
Yes, and it reminds you of that phrase in Paul where he talks about the utmost patience in teaching, doesn't he? Is that
yes?
Where he exalts that of Christian teachers, and I think I mean, I reflect on people who've been extremely patient, with me, because it takes time to assimilate stuff that turns your world upside down, doesn't it? And this teaching, as we'll see, is completely inverts the way of the world. So,
and then he gathers them to him, and then we get his teaching in verses 42, 43, 44, 45. You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and the great ones exercise authority over them, but not so with you. And again, this is just a very striking inversion of all our instincts about power and authority. If someone's going to be an authority over, then they expect obedience.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's it's this idea of lording it over them is also it's picked up actually in 1 Peter, isn't it? It's the same word he uses in 1 Peter 5 verse 3. Do not lord it over those in your charge, but be examples to the flock, which is very interesting, given that's a connection that clearly Peter gets this idea from Jesus himself. He's experienced it from Jesus, as it were, from Jesus. Jesus not lording it over him, and realizes that's the way.
There's a fascinating little phrase here I've just spotted, and I haven't seen this commented in any of the commentaries, but and you lose it in sort of loose translations. So the TNIV says their high officials exercise authority over them. if you have a more word-for-word translation like the ESV, it says, "And their great ones exercise authority over them."
Yeah.
Hoi megaloi auton. Now, it just suddenly struck me that the word rabbi actually means my great one. So that is interesting because it ties in with Jesus' teaching elsewhere. I think it comes in Luke 17 where he says, don't call anybody teacher because you only have one teacher.
Yes.
Don't call anyone my great one
No.
because there's only one who is great.
Yeah.
I probably need to do a bit more homework on that. Friends, if you've got any thoughts
That's
about
a
that, do comment.
fascinating spot there, Ian. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, New RSV translates it as tyrants, or their great ones are tyrants over them. Oh, actually, it does translate. They're great ones.
Great ones.
Yeah, they're great ones are tyrants over them. Yeah,
Yeah.
but it's not so among you. Mm.
Whoever would be great amongst you must be your servant. Whoever would be the first amongst you must be the slave of all. Again, what's really interesting is that this is an inversion of the ambition of James and John, isn't it? Because Jesus says, well, as they want to be great. He says, fine. The way to be great is to be a great servant.
Yeah, and perhaps and the slave of all. I mean, James Edwards in his commentary makes an interesting point here. He says, I mean, we, of course, steeped in reading scripture, and that concept of service, hear that as quite sort of normative. But of course, for them, it's completely counter. I mean, it's not. There doesn't really have any Old Testament precedent, particularly, does it?
No,
In
it
terms of
doesn't. No, it
so
doesn't.
it's kind of it's as radical as the camel through the eye of the needle, which you had earlier in the in the chapter. So it's kind of we need to kind of hear that afresh somehow if we can, because it's tough.
And it's the example of service is always striking. I many years ago I went on the first Springboard mission with Michael Green in 1991,
right?
And had a couple of encounters. He was my vicar when I was a student in Oxford, and it was interesting because he was a very strong character, very confident, great evangelist. Well, one thing I'll never forget about him was that when we were at a dinner at one of the hosts, when the place where we went on the mission, before the meal even ended, he was out of his seat and he had his hands in the washing up bowl. He was the first person to do the washing up.
Yeah.
Which is quite very interesting for someone where you're the guest in someone else's house.
Yes.
He was still, it was as clearly his discipline, because he'd always be the first to help to clear and to wash up and so on.
Yes.
To do acts of service. And it is interesting that how, those kinds of very specific actions, they're really distinctive and they really stand out.
Yes. Yeah.
But this whole thing I'm finding quite painful because in the news this week is a story about a bishop in Scotland who many people have testified has bullied and misused power, and the church is not dealing with it.
Yeah.
And it's just tragic when those attitudes Jesus describes about the Gentiles lorded over them, when just so many places in the church you see church leaders misusing power and authority. I mean, you kind of think that we've forgotten Jesus said all this stuff.
We do, yeah, absolutely. I can remember reading David Watson on this many years ago when he was a curate. He seemed to spend all his time putting chairs out and then putting them away again for multiple parish meetings, and being quite cross about this because he didn't think he was ordained for that. And then actually learning, I think somebody challenged him about it, learning that actually no, that's what Christian service really looks like. Yeah.
And then right at the end, we come across this absolutely outstanding verse. And this is sort of like my main memory verse out of the whole of Mark's gospel.
Yeah.
For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, as you said, there is a sense in which the suffering of Jesus and the service of Jesus is one that we all emulate. But of course, there's one thing about this where Jesus has a unique role of giving his life as a ransom for many. And that language of ransom is fascinating, isn't it? Because it's used in the Old Testament about God ransoming his people. It's a ransom. It's paying back for a debt. It's the language you use in the slave market when a slave who is bought and then is ransomed and set free, and they can't do it themselves. And the really clear thing here is Jesus does something in giving his life to set us free, and he does what we cannot do for ourselves.
He does, and of course it echoes Isaiah, doesn't it? He's the guilt offering, the one who bears our iniquities, and all that. Isaiah 53, suffering servant, which of course I suspect he's drawing on that strongly for his understanding of what his own role. And we ought to just notice this Semitism here. Many equals all, doesn't it?
We should.
Yeah, that's a typical.
Yeah. And that also relates to my own practice when I'm presiding at communion, because in the Church of England, we have a number of different Eucharistic prayers, great prayers of thanksgiving. And in the words of institution, so-called, when we talk about, when Jesus gives, this is my body, this is my blood.
Yeah.
And some of them say, given for you, which of course is addressed to disciples, for the forgiveness of sins. But some of the Eucharistic prayers actually say, given for you and for many for the forgiveness of sin.
Yes.
And because it's there in one of the prayers, I always add it in, because the you is the disciples, the many are the people in front of me that morning.
Yes.
They are part of the many. Jesus gave himself not only for Israel, but as an atoning sacrifice for the sins of the whole world.
Yes.
So, and that's why we gather, and that's why we celebrate and we remember.
Absolutely, and absolutely, and of course in Isaiah the Gentiles are very much in view, aren't they? In that suffering. So
yeah. We've come to the end of our half hour. Fascinating. Thank you very much, James. We didn't remind people of getting the 4 things we love them to do.
No, well, we'd love you to like the videos. Do click like and do subscribe to the channel. You'll get notifications of future videos. Do share on your socials and do comment. We'd love
I'm glad you used the word socials, because I'm afraid last night I did actually watch Strictly Come Dancing, and that's exactly what they said. Follow us on your socials.
Yes,
so you're right at the
as soon as I learned that phrase, I'm seeing it everywhere.
So friends, do contribute, do make comments. We love to see your comments and have conversation with you. Do pass this on, and we hope you found this useful, and we really look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.